The wine glass shattered against the polished hardwood floor of Charleston's newest upscale restaurant, the Southern Pearl. Silence fell over the dining room as the red-faced man in the expensive suit sneered at the owner. He had no idea he'd just picked a fight with a decorated Force Recon Marine, or that his attempt at public humiliation would spark a revolution in the city's restaurant scene. Marcus Washington smoothed down his crisp white apron and surveyed his restaurant's dining room with quiet pride. The evening sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Southern Pearl, casting a warm glow over the polished hardwood floors and elegant table settings. After 20 years of military service and another 5 years of relentless work in the restaurant industry, he'd finally achieved his dream of ownership, transforming a failing diner into Charleston's newest upscale Southern fusion restaurant. Tonight marked 3 months since opening day, and business was steadily growing. The reviews had been stellar, praising both the innovative menu and the impeccable service. Marcus insisted on greeting every guest personally when possible, a habit he'd picked up from his grandmother, who'd run a small soul food restaurant in their hometown. "Table 4 is ready for you to talk wine pairings, chef," Sarah, his head server, called out as she passed by with a tray of appetizers. Marcus nodded and made his way across the dining room. He'd learned early on that customers loved discussing wine selections with the owner, especially when they discovered his extensive knowledge gained from his years stationed in Europe. As he approached the table, he overheard a loud, drawling voice. "I don't know why everyone's making such a fuss about this place," a middle-aged man in an expensive but poorly fitted suit was saying to his dining companion. "It's just another wannabe fancy joint. Probably some corporate chain trying to cash in on the whole local trend." Marcus maintained his professional smile as he reached the table. "Good evening, gentlemen. I understand you'd like to discuss our wine selection." The loud man, whose face was already flushed from what was clearly not his first drink of the evening, barely glanced up. "Yeah, whatever. Just bring us your most expensive bottle. Assuming you know anything about fine wine?" He smirked at his companion, who shifted uncomfortably. "Actually, sir, I'd be happy to recommend something that would pair better with your selected entrees," Marcus replied smoothly. "I spent several years in the Bordeaux region during my military service, and—" "Military?" The man interrupted with a derisive snort. "Let me guess. You were a cook, peeling potatoes somewhere safe while real soldiers did the fighting." The dining room had grown quieter. Marcus could feel eyes on them, including those of his staff, some of whom knew about his 2 Purple Hearts and Silver Star. But he dealt with far worse than this during his 20 years of service, and later as he worked his way up through kitchens where some refused to believe a black man could be an executive chef. "Sir, I was a Marine Corps Force Recon officer," Marcus said quietly. "Now about that wine." "Sure you were," the man laughed, his voice getting louder. "And I'm the Queen of England. Look, boy, just send over someone who actually knows about wine. No offense, but I'm trying to impress a client here." He gestured to his companion, who was now staring intently at his menu, clearly mortified. Sarah had materialized at Marcus's elbow, practically vibrating with suppressed anger. Several nearby diners were openly staring, their expressions ranging from shocked to disgusted. Marcus placed a calming hand on Sarah's shoulder. "I apologize, sir, but I don't believe we'll be able to serve you this evening," Marcus said, his voice steady and professional. "Sarah will bring your check for the drinks." The man's face darkened. "Excuse me? Do you have any idea who I am? I want to speak to the owner right now." A small smile touched Marcus's lips. "You are speaking to the owner. The Southern Pearl is my restaurant. I designed the menu, handpicked every wine in our cellar, and personally trained our staff. And we reserve the right to refuse service to anyone who disrespects our team or our guests." The man's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. His companion stood up abruptly. "I think we're done here, Richard, and you can forget about that contract. I don't do business with people who behave this way." He turned to Marcus and handed him a business card. "I apologize for my former associate's behavior. I'd love to come back another time, perhaps to discuss catering for our company events." As the 2 men left, one rushing out in embarrassment, the other still sputtering indignantly, an unexpected round of applause broke out in the dining room. Marcus raised his hands in gentle protest, though he was touched by the show of support. The rest of the evening passed smoothly. Marcus made his usual rounds, discussing wine and food with genuinely interested guests, many of whom seemed eager to share their own stories or express their appreciation for his service, both military and culinary. Later that night, after the last guest had left and the staff was finishing their cleanup, Marcus sat at the bar reviewing the day's receipts. Sarah placed a cup of coffee in front of him, strong and black, just the way he liked it. "You handled that situation better than he deserved," she said, leaning against the bar. Marcus smiled. My grandmother used to say that the best revenge against ignorance is success. When I was stationed in Japan, my commanding officer taught me something similar. He said that true strength isn't about winning fights. It's about knowing which ones aren't worth having. He glanced around his restaurant, at the walls adorned with both his military honors and his culinary achievements, at the photos of his family going back 3 generations of food service workers and military veterans, at the staff who had become like a second family. Besides, he continued, that man walked in here expecting to find evidence to support his prejudices. Instead, he got a lesson in humility, lost a business deal, and missed out on what I'm told is the best braised short rib in Charleston. He winked at Sarah. I'd say justice served itself just fine. Sarah laughed and raised her water glass in a mock toast. To justice served with a side of humble pie. Marcus clinked his coffee cup against her glass, thinking about how far he'd come from those days of peeling potatoes in boot camp. Not that there had been anything wrong with that job either. Every role had its purpose. Something else the Marines had taught him. He'd started at the bottom in both the military and the restaurant industry, and he'd earned every step up through hard work, determination, and the willingness to prove himself over and over again. The incident would probably make its way onto social media. These things usually did, but Marcus wasn't worried. He'd built his success on a foundation of excellence and respect, treating everyone who walked through his doors with the same dignity he expected in return. Well, almost everyone. Some people, like tonight's uncomfortable customer, needed a gentle reminder about basic human decency. As he finished his coffee and prepared to head home, Marcus thought about the next day's special events, a veterans breakfast program he'd started, offering free meals and job training to military personnel transitioning to civilian life. He smiled, remembering his own challenging transition and the mentors who had helped him along the way. Now he was in a position to do the same for others. The next morning, as Marcus unlocked the restaurant's doors, he noticed a small group of people already waiting outside. Among them was an elderly man leaning on a cane, wearing a Korean War veteran's cap. Behind him stood 2 young women in current military uniforms, presumably on leave or recently discharged. "Welcome to the Southern Pearl," Marcus said warmly, holding the door open. "Please, come in out of the cold." The elderly veteran paused as he passed. "Heard about what happened last night," he said quietly. "My granddaughter showed me the video. Wanted to come support a fellow soldier's business." Marcus helped the man inside. "Marine," he corrected with a gentle smile. The veteran chuckled. "Marines, soldiers, you all look the same to us old Air Force boys. But you did good, son. Showed more class than that fellow deserved." As Marcus got them settled with coffee and menus, he noticed more people arriving, some in uniform, others in civilian clothes, but many wearing hats or pins indicating their military service. Word had indeed gotten around, but not in the way that angry customer might have expected. Sarah arrived for her morning shift and paused in the doorway, taking in the growing crowd. "Looks like we're going to need more coffee," she said with a grin. "And more biscuits," Marcus added, already heading toward the kitchen. Grandma always said food brings people together, and she never turned away a hungry guest. He paused, then added with a twinkle in his eye, "Well, almost never." The morning sun streamed through the windows, catching the medals and commendations on the wall. Below them hung a small framed photograph of a much younger Marcus in his dress blues, standing proudly next to his grandmother outside her small restaurant. Next to it was a newer photo, taken on the Southern Pearl's opening day, showing Marcus in his chef's whites, surrounded by his staff, a diverse group of people who had become family. 2 very different uniforms, 2 different kinds of service, but the same core values: honor, respect, and the belief that everyone deserves a seat at the table, as long as they know how to behave at it. As the morning crowd continued to grow, Marcus noticed a familiar face among the new arrivals. James Chen, his old platoon sergeant from his first deployment. They hadn't seen each other in person for nearly 5 years, though they kept in touch through occasional phone calls and social media. "You still can't stay out of trouble, can you, Captain?" James said with a grin, pulling Marcus into a tight hug. "Saw the video this morning and hopped on the first flight from Atlanta. Figured you might need some backup." Marcus laughed, leading James to a quiet corner of the bar. "You didn't have to come all this way, James. Besides, shouldn't you be running your own restaurant?" "My sous chef can handle things for a day," James replied, settling onto a bar stool. "Besides, I needed to check out the competition. Word is you're giving me a run for my money in the Southern Fusion category." Their shared history went deeper than most people knew. After their time in the Marines, Both had pursued their culinary dreams, supporting each other through cooking school and their early restaurant careers. James had opened his successful Atlanta restaurant 2 years before Marcus launched the Southern Pearl, and his advice had been invaluable during the planning stages. Speaking of competition, James said, his expression growing serious, "You should know that the guy from last night, Richard Thompson, he's not just any angry customer. He's a major restaurant investor in the Southeast, known for hostile takeovers of promising new establishments." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "You think he came here looking for trouble?" "I think he came here looking for leverage," James replied. His usual move is to find some way to discredit new restaurant owners, then swoop in with a lowball offer when they're struggling. But, he added with a satisfied smile, he didn't count on picking a fight with a Force Recon Marine who has the whole community behind him. As if to emphasize his point, the restaurant door chimed again. This time, a local news crew entered, led by a familiar face, Christina Park, the city's most respected restaurant critic. She had given the Southern Pearl a glowing review in its first month. "Chef Washington," she called out, making her way through the crowd, "I was hoping to get your perspective on last night's events, and perhaps a broader conversation about the challenges minority veteran business owners face in the industry." Marcus exchanged a knowing look with James. They'd both faced their share of prejudice and skepticism in the food industry. Marcus as a black chef in fine dining, James as an Asian American pushing the boundaries of traditional Southern cuisine. "Actually," Marcus said, "I'd be honored to share that conversation, but I think we need to make it bigger than just my story." He gestured to the diverse crowd filling his restaurant. "Would you be interested in hearing from all these veterans about their experiences transitioning to civilian life, starting businesses, and finding their place in our community?" Christina's eyes lit up at the suggestion. "That would be incredible. A real conversation about service, sacrifice, and success, and how food brings people together." Throughout the day, the Southern Pearl became more than just a restaurant. It transformed into a gathering place for sharing stories, building connections, and breaking down barriers. Veterans from different eras and backgrounds sat together, trading tales over plates of Marcus's signature dishes. Young entrepreneurs sought advice from successful business owners, while community leaders discussed ways to better support veteran-owned businesses. Richard Thompson's attempt to intimidate had backfired spectacularly, creating exactly the kind of community solidarity he had likely hoped to prevent. Local business owners who heard the story began reaching out, offering to form a coalition of independent restaurants to protect against predatory investors. By evening, when the regular dinner service was set to begin, Marcus had more than just a full reservation book. He had a movement building. James helped him in the kitchen during the rush, just like old times, while Sarah coordinated with extra staff who'd volunteered to help handle the overflow crowd. As Marcus worked the line, perfectly plating each dish that left his kitchen, he could hear the buzz of conversation and laughter from the dining room. The walls seemed to pulse with the energy of people coming together, not in anger over what had happened, but in celebration of what was possible when a community united. Late that night, after the last guest had left and the kitchen was spotless, a Marine's habits die hard, Marcus sat with James and Sarah, sharing a bottle of his prized Bordeaux, the same wine Thompson had dismissed without tasting. "You know what's funny?" Marcus said, swirling the ruby liquid in his glass. "That man came in here thinking he could shame me for who I am. Instead, he reminded me of exactly why I opened this place." Sarah looked curious. "To serve amazing food." "That's part of it," Marcus smiled, "but mainly to create a space where everyone feels valued, where we can share meals and stories, and realize we're not so different after all." He raised his glass. "My grandmother used to say that food is love made visible. But this place, what happened here today, that's community made visible." James nodded thoughtfully. "Speaking of community, what are you going to do about Thompson? He's not going to take this humiliation lightly." Marcus's expression remained serene. "The same thing I did in the Corps when faced with a stronger enemy. Adapt, overcome, and remember that I'm not fighting alone." He pulled out his phone, showing them the dozens of messages he'd received from other restaurant owners, veterans, and community leaders, all offering support and partnership. "Besides," he continued, a hint of his earlier smile returning, "I learned something else in the Marines. The best defense is a good offense." He pulled out a folder containing plans for a veteran-focused restaurant incubator program he'd been developing. "I think it's time to expand, but not the way Thompson does it. We're going to lift up other veteran owners, help them start their own places, create a network so big that guys like him can't push any of us around." Sarah raised her glass. "To making good trouble?" "To making good trouble," Marcus and James echoed, their glasses clinking in the quiet restaurant. The gleam in Marcus's eyes suggested that this was just the beginning. Thompson had tried to make him feel small in his own restaurant, but instead, he'd inadvertently helped launch something much bigger than himself. Sometimes, Marcus reflected, the best response to hatred isn't just success. It's creating opportunities for others to succeed too. Outside, Charleston's historic streets were quiet, but inside the Southern Pearl, plans were taking shape that would change the city's restaurant scene forever. And it all started because one man forgot that you should never judge a restaurant owner by the color of his skin, or underestimate a Marine who's fought for everything he has. The following weeks brought a steady stream of success to the Southern Pearl. Business was booming, and Marcus's veteran incubator program was gaining traction, with local banks offering special financing options for participants. But as James had predicted, Richard Thompson wasn't finished. The first sign of trouble came through Marcus's suppliers. His regular meat vendor called one morning, apologetically explaining that they could no longer fulfill his orders due to an exclusive contract with a new restaurant group. By the end of the week, 3 more suppliers had dropped him, each offering similar vague explanations. "He's trying to choke us out," Sarah said, reviewing their dwindling inventory. "These are all suppliers that Thompson's restaurant group has stakes in," Marcus noted, his expression thoughtful rather than worried. "Good thing we planned for this." He pulled out his phone and dialed a number. "Hey, Rodriguez, remember that conversation we had about local sourcing? Time to put it into action." Carlos Rodriguez was a fellow veteran who transformed his family farm after returning from Afghanistan. He'd been one of the first to reach out after the Thompson incident, offering to supply the Southern Pearl with organic, locally grown produce. Now, he helped connect Marcus with a network of veteran-owned farms and small-scale suppliers across the state. But Thompson's retaliation didn't stop there. Negative reviews began flooding review sites, all suspiciously similar in tone, all from newly created accounts. Then came the health inspector, making unprecedented frequent visits, clearly responding to anonymous complaints. The final strike came through Marcus's landlord. Thompson's investment group had purchased the building, and suddenly, the Southern Pearl's lease renewal terms became impossibly steep. "He's trying to bury us," Sarah said one morning, watching Marcus review the new lease terms. "What are we going to do?" Marcus's response was interrupted by James Chen bursting through the door, waving a tablet. "Tell me you've seen this," he said, pulling up a local business news website. The headline read, "Thompson Restaurant Group announces new Southern Heritage dining concept, coming soon to historic Charleston." "He's opening a competing restaurant," James explained, 3 blocks from here. "And get this, he's basically copying your entire concept, but with a twist. He's marketing it as traditional Southern cuisine, traditionally owned." James's face twisted with disgust. The dog whistle isn't even subtle. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, staring at the article. Then, surprisingly, he smiled. "You know what this means?" he asked. "We've got him rattled." He stood up and gathered his staff for an impromptu meeting. The Southern Pearl's team had grown more diverse over the past weeks, as Marcus had made a point of hiring veterans, particularly those who needed a second chance or were struggling to transition to civilian life. "Listen up," he began. "Thompson thinks he can break us by cutting off our supplies, smearing our reputation, and trying to price us out of our home. He's betting that we'll either fail or sell out to him at a discount." His smile grew wider. "But he's fighting the last war. We've already adapted." Over the next hour, Marcus laid out his battle plan. They'd already secured new supply lines through veteran-owned businesses. The fake reviews were being countered by an overwhelming number of genuine positive ones, as their loyal customers fought back. The health inspector's frequent visits, they'd passed each one with flying colors, thanks to the military-grade preparation standards Marcus had always insisted upon. As for the lease situation, Marcus revealed his masterstroke. "Remember that business card from Thompson's former client that night? Turns out he's on the board of the historic Charleston Preservation Society. They've been looking for ways to protect local businesses from predatory developers. As of this morning, they've approved our application to purchase this building outright, with historic preservation status." The staff erupted in cheers, but Marcus wasn't finished. Now, about Thompson's new restaurant, he pulled out the plans for his incubator program. "We're going to accelerate our expansion, but not just here in Charleston. James has agreed to partner with us in Atlanta. Rodriguez is converting part of his farm into a training facility. We're going to create opportunities faster than Thompson can buy them up." He turned to the wall where his military honors hung. "In the Marines, we learned that the best way to defeat an enemy is not to fight them on their terms. Thompson wants to make this about race and tradition. We'll make it about community and innovation. He wants to divide people. We'll bring them together." The next few months became a masterclass in community organizing. While Thompson poured money into marketing his new restaurant, Marcus focused on building relationships. He partnered with local schools to create culinary training programs for at-risk youth. He worked with veteran organizations to provide job opportunities and business mentorship. The Southern Pearl became known not just for its food, but for its mission. When Thompson's Southern Heritage restaurant finally opened, it was to mediocre reviews and controversy. Food critics couldn't help but compare it unfavorably to the Southern Pearl's innovative cuisine. More damaging were the stories that began emerging about Thompson's business practices, as former employees and partners felt emboldened to speak out. But the final blow came from an unexpected quarter. Marcus's landlord must have revealed Thompson's tactics to the historic Charleston Preservation Society because they launched an investigation into his business practices, combined with the public relations nightmare of his failed restaurant and the growing success of the veteran-owned business network. Thompson's investors began pulling out. 6 months after his attempt to destroy the Southern Pearl, Richard Thompson's restaurant group filed for bankruptcy. The Southern Heritage location closed before it had even found its footing. Meanwhile, the Southern Pearl had expanded to include a catering operation and a food truck program, both staffed primarily by veterans in training. One evening, as Marcus was closing up, he noticed a familiar face peering through the window. Thompson himself, looking considerably less polished than the night of their first encounter. After a moment's consideration, Marcus opened the door. "We're closed," he said, "but I can make an exception if you're hungry." Thompson's face flushed with familiar anger, but then deflated. "Why?" he asked. "Why didn't you just sell when you had the chance? It would have been easier." Marcus thought about his grandmother's restaurant, about his time in the Marines, about all the people who had helped him along the way, and all those he was now helping in turn. "Because some things aren't for sale," he replied simply. "Would you like to come in and learn why?" Thompson hesitated, then shook his head and walked away. Marcus watched him go, feeling not triumph, but a complex mixture of pity and hope. Maybe someday Thompson would understand that success built on pushing others down never lasted, or maybe he wouldn't. Either way, the Southern Pearl would continue to shine, a beacon of what was possible when people chose to lift each other up instead. Epilogue. 5 years later, the evening sun cast long shadows through the Southern Pearl's expanded dining room, where photos and memorabilia now covered nearly every wall. Among the military honors and restaurant reviews hung dozens of framed photographs, graduates of the Veterans Culinary Program, successful restaurant openings, community events, and families celebrating special moments. Marcus stood in the center of his restaurant, adjusting his chef's whites as a film crew set up their equipment. The Food Network had finally convinced him to participate in a documentary about veteran-owned restaurants, though he'd insisted that it feature other success stories from his incubator program as well. "Ready when you are, Chef Washington," the producer called out. Before Marcus could respond, the door chimed. A young black woman in marine dress blues entered, accompanied by an older man Marcus hadn't seen in 5 years, Richard Thompson. The restaurant fell silent. Marcus noticed Thompson's appearance had changed dramatically. Gone was the expensive suit and arrogant bearing. He looked smaller somehow, humbled, leaning slightly on a cane. "I apologize for interrupting," Thompson said quietly. "I know you're busy, but I was hoping we could talk." He gestured to the Marine beside him. "This is my daughter, Captain Lisa Thompson. She just returned from deployment." Marcus exchanged a look with Sarah, who had materialized at his side, as she always did when Thompson's name came up. She gave him a slight nod. "The crew needs 15 minutes to set up anyway," Marcus said. "Please, join me at the bar." As they settled onto the bar stools, the same ones where Marcus had planned his resistance to Thompson's takeover attempt 5 years ago, Lisa Thompson spoke up. "Mr. Washington, my father told me everything that happened," she said, her posture military straight. "But that's not why we're here. I'm being medically discharged due to injuries from my last tour. Dad thought maybe I could apply to your culinary program." Marcus studied Thompson's face, seeing not the angry man from 5 years ago, but a father trying to help his daughter. "The program has a 3-month waiting list," he said carefully. "I understand," Thompson replied, starting to stand. "But," Marcus continued, "we do have an immediate opening for a management trainee. The position includes culinary training." He turned to Lisa. "That is, if you don't mind learning from an old Force Recon Marine." The smile that lit up Lisa's face reminded Marcus of every veteran who'd found their new purpose in his kitchen. "When can I start, sir?" As Marcus discussed the details with Lisa, Thompson remained quiet, staring at his folded hands. Finally, when Lisa stepped away to call her mother with the news, he spoke. "I was wrong," he said simply, "about everything. It took losing everything I'd built to understand what you were really creating here." He gestured to the walls of memories. "This isn't just a restaurant. It's A mission, Marcus finished for him. Just a different kind of service. The next hour passed in a blur of filming, as Marcus shared the story of the Southern Pearl's growth into something much bigger than himself. The Veterans Culinary Program had expanded to 15 cities across the Southeast. The incubator network had helped launch over 40 successful restaurants, creating a support system that went far beyond business. James Chen appeared on camera from his Atlanta location, where he was mentoring 3 new veteran-owned restaurants. Rodriguez called in from his farm, which had become a model for sustainable agriculture and veteran rehabilitation through farming. Sarah spoke about their latest initiative, a food truck fleet staffed by veterans that provided meals to homeless shelters and disaster relief efforts. But the most powerful moment came when Lisa Thompson, still in her dress blues, stepped in front of the camera. 5 years ago, my father tried to tear this place down because he couldn't see past his own prejudices, she said, her voice strong and clear. Today, he brought me here because he finally understood what Chef Washington knew all along, that true success isn't about pushing others down, it's about pulling them up with you. Later that night, after the film crew had packed up and the last customers had left, Marcus sat at his usual spot at the bar. Sarah placed his coffee in front of him, still strong and black. Some habits never changed. You know what this means? She asked, nodding toward Thompson's business card, which he'd left with a note offering to help expand the program's funding network. Marcus smiled, thinking of his grandmother's small restaurant, of his first days in the Marines, of all the battles fought and lessons learned. It means the mission continues, he said, just with some unexpected new allies. He glanced at the wall where it had all started, his grandmother's photo next to his Marine Corps commission, now surrounded by hundreds of other success stories. Each one represented a life changed, a dream realized, a bridge built between communities. The last light of day faded from the windows, but the Southern Pearl glowed with its own kind of light, the warmth of welcome, the brightness of opportunity, the steady flame of dignity that no prejudice could extinguish. And somewhere, Marcus knew, his grandmother was smiling, proud that her grandson had learned the most important lesson of all, that the best revenge isn't just success, but using that success to help others find their own way home.